here we go. Okay. Good evening. I'm Rich Rosenthal. I'm president of the North Jersey Civil War Roundtable. Just want to welcome you. We just listened to a marvelous presentation of Janet Whaley of Pasadena. Now I'm about to tell you a little bit about our group, and I'll try to eliminate the ums and as I speak. We've been in existence for about 25 years. We're noted for the caliber of our speakers. I'm proud to say we already have 2 Pulitzer Prize winners, James McPherson and Eric Boner, and we would have had a third one, Edward Larson, but that was due to COVID. Some of our speakers included James Bud Robertson, Craig Simons, Ed Bars, and with brilliant speakers, we have Jeff Hunt and Professor Jennifer Murray speak before our groups, including Andy Watsky, who's the official General Meade of Pennsylvania. We are members at the color bearer level of now it's Battlefield Trust. And we are also active, calling to people who are not in our area about History Day. History Day is a United States competition. It's in all states. And we've just given our award winners, and our award winners coincidentally will be making it to the finals at the University of Maryland. As I continue on, I now want to give credit to a number of libraries, and I mentioned this before. We have offered our programs as a public service to libraries who want to carry our program. Our programs are carried on their links, and people make a request of the library, not from us to become part of it. So shout out number 1 to our Parsippany Library. We have it. Other libraries who are part of it, the Chester Library, the Hackettstown Library, the Kemmerer Library of Harding Township, Rockaway Township, a Mendham Library, Roxbury Library, and also put some notices on the board of the Plainfield Library and the Middletown Libraries who put it on their board. So we're now, and that's where we are with the other groups coming on. I'm just trying to think what else I wanted to add on to here, and that's as far as. But if anybody, we don't mind any library who wants to come on. It's no charge. Just send you a link for it, and then you send the link to your own people. So we'd be glad to carry you. And also, what I understand from the libraries, they also get full credit for the attendees, the participants as their attendees. And right now we have 111 people online, and that's the one thing we do. We're used to this, so our Zoom capacity normally would be for 100 people. We pay the additional sum, we carry it, and brings us up to 500. Right now we're at 111, and that's so I don't have to worry about people on. And as I'm speaking, Vic Vignola just sent me, and I don't know how to get to him, but Vic Vignola also is a speaker. He's up for the Battlefield Trust Book Award. He just won the prestigious Fletcher Pratt Award through this. Okay, let me just see 1 or 2 more things before we go. It'll dawn on me after I say let's go. Okay, now let me introduce Professor Lurie. This is about the 8th and 9th time I have Professor Lurie. This is one thing you can do when you're in charge of a program. You get the speakers that you want, and Professor Lurie is somebody that I always wanted since I heard him for the first time, and I sort of became it doesn't add a comment, but I'm sort of become a groupie. I've gone to other places that he spoke on a wide variety of subjects. Union County, the Labor House in the Botto House in North Haledon, and a few other places I've heard him speak. In any event, he's noted for his scholarly approach to his subject matter. He is a sought-after and frequent speaker at historical societies, presenting a wide variety of historical subjects. He's been a speaker, I mentioned, for over 12 years, focusing on a different facet of Abraham Lincoln every year. At Rutgers University, Professor Lurie specialized in American legal history, constitutional history, law and literature, and American political history. His latest book is a case study of the Pocket Veto, actually of 1926 to 1929. He also wrote the biography of Taft, didn't include that. He retired in 2014. He's married to Professor Maxine Lurie, former head of history department at Seton Hall, and she's president of New Jersey Historical Commission, a noted author whose works include being co-editor of the Encyclopedia of New Jersey, and her books are in every, when I say, never say every library of New Jersey. So we're really pleased to have Professor Lurie come back, and welcome.
To hear such an introduction. For a while, I wasn't sure who Rich was talking about, but then I recognized a little bit of familiarities. And Rich is accurate. I have spoken a number of times to the Civil War Roundtable, and I've always enjoyed not just being there before COVID, but the questions that come at the end of the session, as you will have a chance, I suspect, to find out. So I would call what I'm going to discuss with you a talk on Lincoln and his Supreme Court justices, the politics of reality. Now, I think in some ways Abraham Lincoln has been imprisoned by our history. We are so addicted to the Civil War and the legacy of the Civil War. And of course, Lincoln is at the midst of that legacy. We tend to forget that Lincoln was president of a large country, and the Civil War battles only occupied a very small portion of it, mostly in the Southeast, going as far as, you know, north of Maryland and west as Gettysburg. The rest of the country grew and expanded, and Lincoln had to do much more than try to desperately find a competent general, which took him almost 4 years, as you all know. So I am interested in some other aspects of Lincoln's tenure. Specifically for tonight, I want to talk about his 5 judges. They included, by the way, an ex-doctor and a Quaker. Did you know that there was a Quaker on the United States Supreme Court? Well, there was. Only one, as far as I can tell, and I'll tell you more about him in a little while. Unfortunately, he was a very undistinguished judge, and that's probably why he isn't very well known. He did not write a lot of opinions that ring out. Most of them came with a dull thud rather than ringing out. And I'll talk more about him in due time. Now, as I said, Lincoln had 5 appointments, all made in a very short tenure between 1862 and 1864. His last appointment was in the end of 1864. I'll mention all 5 and talk about all 5, but 3 of them warrant a little more detail. The 3 that I'm going to focus on mostly are Samuel Miller from Iowa, who served on the court for 28 years, Stephen Field from California, who for many years had the record for length on the court until it was broken by William Douglas not too long ago. He served for 34 years, as I said, and Salmon Chase from Ohio, who served barely for 8.5, almost 9 years. He had the shortest tenure of all of Lincoln's judges. Less will be said about 3 minor justices, although they remain of interest. One I've already hinted at. He's the Quaker, whose name was Noah Swain, and he came from Ohio, and he was on the court for 19 years. And then Lincoln named his best friend, one of his best friends, and Lincoln, by the way, did not have a lot of very best close friends. But this gentleman was David Davis, a lawyer from Illinois, with whom Lincoln had rode circuit for more than 20 years. And you'll hear more about Davis toward the end of my talk. And Davis, of these 3 less than distinguished judges, is remembered for one very significant case, which still has relevance for us. So, and before I talk about the judges in detail, let me remind you that Lincoln was a wartime president. The war consumed him, and he had to spend more time on it than other presidents who have had war issues. I think immediately of Woodrow Wilson or Franklin Roosevelt. Now, if Abraham Lincoln had had someone like George Marshall at his side, as Roosevelt did, Lincoln might have been able to spend much more time on domestic issues than he did. As it is, the war consumed him. Certain duties, however, he had to fulfill, and key among them was the appointment of Supreme Court vacancies. As you will see, the vacancies led indirectly to important constitutional developments concerning the conduct of the war. So Lincoln's appointments become significant. Now, we still don't know the intricate workings of a Supreme Court appointment in the 19th century. We can pretty well ascertain how Lincoln found his 5 choices, which is rather interesting. But again, his main concern was not judges as much as picking people who would do what Lincoln felt was vital, and I emphasize the word vital. It's not clear, for example, if he ever met Stephen Field. We're not sure. Or, for that matter, Samuel Miller. Miller from Iowa and Field from California. In terms of influencing the president, the most important members of Congress come into play. The congressional delegation, which in those days for many states was relatively small. The congressional delegation would be a very influential link to Lincoln's appointments because they were politicians. They spoke Lincoln's language, and they knew from their own experiences who they were talking about. Lincoln didn't have to meet Samuel Miller because he heard so much about him from the congressional delegation. On the other hand, Lincoln had to be satisfied that the key question of each of these appointments had to be answered. The sine qua non for Lincoln. Did they support the Union? To what extent did they support the Union? Such support had to be very obvious. You don't assume it. It had to be clear, or Lincoln wasn't interested. Now, what did such support mean? It included, in the first place, the most obvious point, an unequivocal backing for the Union. That's first and foremost. Then it had to include judicial endorsement of the Southern blockade. You will hear more about that case toward the end of my talk, but let me tell you a little bit about the blockade. One of the first things Lincoln did when the South fired on Sumter was to order a Southern blockade of the entire Southeast Atlantic coast. Now, at the time, according to historians, President Lincoln had maybe 3 ships that could work a blockade. Those of you who know your geography will assume that 3 ships was not a very effective blockade, and it wasn't. but it became effective with each passing month. And by 1863, going into 1864, the South was being strangled, not so much on the battlefield, I should say not only on the battlefield, but in economic terms as well. Now, why was the blockade so effective? Because countries like France and particularly England honored the blockade. How could you honor a blockade when there were maybe 3 or 4 ships enforcing it? Nonetheless, Lord Russell, who was the foreign minister of Great Britain, Lord Russell said, we will assume that it is effective and we will honor the blockade. And British ships were forbidden to try to come across to the southern coast. And they, for the most part, didn't. Now, why did Russell say that? Well, we think the reason is not so much the Civil War, which Russell saw as a domestic issue and wasn't at all sure that the South would lose or even that the South should lose, but that would change over time. But Russell, like many British prime ministers, or foreign ministers rather, Russell was worried about the future. In an island country like England, an effective navy is vital for survival. Ask anyone who lived through World War II or suffered through World War I. Russell was worried not so much about the 1860s, he was worried about the future. Let's go forward very quickly. In 1914, the British declared war on Germany, and the Allies were plunged into what would be, at that point, the bloodiest war in human history. And in due time, the Americans, who proclaimed under Woodrow Wilson with grandiose rhetoric that they would be neutral. They would be neutral in word and deed. And the issue came, what do neutral powers, what relationship do they have to the belligerents? And Russell asked that the Americans refrain from permitting shipments to Germany. And he pointed to the Civil War precedent. And he said I'm putting it in less diplomatic language, but what he essentially said was, look, we backed your blockade when it was virtually nothing. Now we have a blockade that is going to strangle the Germans if it is effective. And you must help it be effective by not trying to breach it. And the United States quietly acquiesced. Well, let's get back to reality. The blockade was the first point besides the support for the Union. The second was support for Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus. These two measures, the blockade and suspension of habeas corpus, came very early in Lincoln's tenure, and both were unprecedented. Of course, the blockade was obviously unprecedented, but most American lawyers were very familiar with habeas corpus, even in the days of few law schools. Now, for those of you who are not legalists among you, very briefly, habeas corpus is Latin for the term "we have the body." And what it means is that you can't just languish in jail. You have a right to ask a judge to listen to you. This is before you're tried. So the writ of habeas corpus is a strong bulwark of American legal history. And the Constitution says simply that the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless in the case of a national emergency or some such terminology. What's significant is that it does not say who can suspend the writ. Now, Lincoln becomes president on March 4th, 1861. On July 4th, note the symmetry of the date, on July 4th, he calls Congress into session and proclaims a rebellion and calls for troops. And he had already suspended the writ of habeas corpus. That would eventually reach the Supreme Court, and it's one of the few significant cases that Lincoln lived to consider and, as you'll see, worry very much about. Okay, so those were the three conditions for these judges. Who would he appoint? He had no time for extended interviews, all the more because he was well acquainted with two of his ultimate choices. Salmon Chase had served in Lincoln's cabinet for almost 4 years as Secretary of the Treasury. For those of you who are aficionados of trivia, you want to see a picture of Salmon Chase on a bill, I think you have to look for either the $10,000 bill or the $20,000 bill, and they are in existence, although they are not in current circulation. But that's where you'll see a picture of Salmon Chase. Anyway, David Davis, as I said, was a very close friend of Lincoln. He knew both very well. Now, what I haven't mentioned thus far in talking about these 5 judges is the issue of slavery. Why haven't I mentioned it yet? The issue is important because for Lincoln, slavery was less significant than the Union. And Lincoln, who was an honest politician, and I emphasize the word because today that seems to be almost an extinct quality. And in many instances, he said clearly that the Union was fundamental. I'll give you just one quick example. In 1862, and I may refer to this a little later, Lincoln wrote a very famous letter to Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Herald Tribune. In those days, the Tribune was much more distinguished than the New York Times. Now the Herald Tribune is extinguished, not distinguished. But in those days, it was a significant paper. Greeley wrote an angry editorial in 1862 denouncing Lincoln, and I'm paraphrasing. He said, "What the hell have you been doing for almost a year and a half or 2 years? Why haven't you freed the slaves? What are you waiting for?" And Lincoln, who was a very adept, talented, flexible politician. We forget that Lincoln was those. He replied in a letter to Greeley that he knew would be published, as indeed it was. And its most famous lines are where he said, "I didn't think there was any doubt about what I was doing." He said, "I would save the Union. I would save it the fastest way I can. If I could save it without freeing any slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and not others, I would do it. What I do," he said, "I do because I believe it will help the Union, not that it will help or hurt slavery," etc. And he ended the letter by saying, "I intend no modification of my oft-expressed wish that all men everywhere could be free." So in the early years of the war, for Lincoln, it was a war for union. And that, as I said, was primary for his appointment of judges. Now, Lincoln lived long enough to see the 13th Amendment passed by both houses and sent on its way to the states. So he knew before his death that abolition was probably a foregone reality. The only issue was when the final state numbers would come in for ratification. And thus, Lincoln wasn't too worried about how his 5 appointments felt about abolition, because with the amendment, it was irrelevant. It didn't make any difference. Now, the second point about the 5 judges, when the South seceded, about half of the members of Congress left. They just got up and said goodbye and left. Very few of them stayed in Washington. Most of them returned to their states. But their absence was crucial to what the Republicans did. The Democratic Party traditionally had been a party that did not welcome federal activity, excessive federal spending, federal internal improvements, that sort of thing. This is not new. One of the most famous controversies in Andrew Jackson's era was his veto of a road bill that would have put a federal highway in the Midwest. So the absence of this conservative, fiscally restraining group of congressmen who dominated Congress from the 1800 to 1861, when, as I say, they left. This facilitated both westward expansion, which went on as did the war, and a dramatic increase in federal legislation. 2 of the most famous acts ever passed by Congress came out of the first years of the Civil War. One was the Homestead Act, which gave to whoever would agree to settle it and farm it and develop it for 5 years, 160 acres of the public domain. The second act, the Morrill Act, set up the land grant schools. Now think how much we take them for granted now, because every state has a land grant school, as you know. But in 1861, that was a different matter. These statutes were packed with significance. And it went on because the South, as I say, had disappeared. Further, more to our point, Congress created an additional judicial circuit, the 10th Circuit. Did you know that for about 8 or 9 years, from 1862 to 1869, there were 10 justices on the Supreme Court. In 1869, it was brought back to 9. There's nothing sacred, I might add, about the number 9. The court started with fewer. It went to 7, then it went to 9, then, as I just mentioned, it went to 10. And had Franklin Roosevelt had his way, it would have been 15. But that's another story which we don't have time to go into. So, Western influence was reflected in Lincoln's appointments also. Samuel Miller and Stephen Field. Miller from Iowa. Let me talk about Samuel Miller. He's one of my favorite justices on the court. He's the only Supreme Court justice I know of who trained as a physician, practiced medicine, abandoned it and studied law on his own, and was admitted to the bar. He gained admission to the bar in 1847. And when he was appointed to the Supreme Court in 1862. That was Lincoln's second appointment. I'll go back to Noah Swain toward the end of my talk. Miller became the first justice ever appointed west of the Mississippi, a sign of things to come. Now, I mentioned that Lincoln probably never met Miller, but the congressional delegation from Iowa was unanimous in vigorous and vocal support. And it was enough for Lincoln. Miller, as did all the other judges candidates, fill those three criteria I mentioned at the beginning. Also, he had been a vigorous supporter of Lincoln in the 1860 election. That certainly didn't hurt his chances. Now, in 1863, Congress created the 10th Circuit, and thus gave Lincoln another appointment to the court. It would be his third. Indicative of Lincoln's political sophistication, he picked a Democrat from the West, an expert in mining and land law, who was on the California Supreme Court and had made a reputation as a very able lawyer. This was the staunch Democrat named Stephen Field. And let me tell you a little bit about Field. He was the sixth of 10 children born to Submit Dickinson Field. I think that's a very appropriate first name. 10 children, Submit Dickinson Field. At any rate, two of his brothers gained distinction, as well as Stephen. His older brother, Cyrus, orchestrated the laying of the first transatlantic cable. And one of his other brothers, David Dudley Field, was a nationally known attorney with whom reputation Lincoln was very familiar, who argued in front of his brother later on. And I point out that in those days, that was not considered inappropriate. You could very easily practice law in front of a relative. Now, I think that would be regarded as inappropriate. For Field, however, he was the right man in the right place with the right credentials and the right support. He was able, he was articulate, he was aggressive, and he would remain on the bench, as I said, for 34 years, closely identified with the emergence of what we call substantive due process and the importance of something that was yet to come. Lincoln would not live to see it, the emergence and creation of the 14th Amendment, which was and remains the most important amendment in the Constitution. So that accounts for 3 of the 5. Then, with the exception of his close friend, David Davis, Lincoln, I'll get back to Davis toward the end. Lincoln was well acquainted with Salmon Chase, who had named as his Secretary of the Treasury. Chase is a intriguing, interesting figure. He had been married 3 times, and death had taken each of his wives, as well as a number of his young children. What a veil of misery this world is, he mourned. To me, it has been emphatically so. Death has pursued me incessantly ever since I was 25. Sometimes I feel as if I could give up, as if I must give up. And then, after all, I rise and press on, unquote. And so he did, exuding a strong sense of moral duty, ultimately dying as a widower in 1873. On the other hand, his somewhat morbid sense of political purpose was matched by a perennial, purposeful political ambition, which sometimes verged upon the ruthless. Chase had served in Lincoln's cabinet as Secretary of the Treasury. He did a very good job, by the way. It's really something to be able to say, as Chase could say in 1865, that the financial health of the Union was stronger than it had been in 1861. And this was after the bloodiest and most expensive war thus far in our history. He was also one of a small group of Republicans who would convince themselves that they were all much better qualified for the presidency than Lincoln. This included, besides Salmon Chase, William H. Seward. Seward, senator from New York, had stated so publicly that he would be the most effective man they could find in 1860 to nominate for the new Republican Party. Chase did more than Seward in that he told Lincoln to his face that he was much better qualified than the president, and the president should understand it. Moreover, he often threatened to resign, only to have Lincoln cajole him into remaining on in the cabinet. Finally, in the summer of 1864, with his renomination secure, with Grant finally starting to win major battles, Chase pulled it once too often, and to his amazement and frustration, Lincoln accepted the resignation. But you will hear more from Chase, as I say, in a minute. On the other hand, Lincoln was very much aware of Chase's, not only of his total commitment to abolition and the Union, and by 1864, which is what we're talking about, by 1864, Lincoln had come to the realization that survival of the Union meant the abolition of slavery. They went out together. You couldn't have one without the other. That was not true of Lincoln's mind in 1862. Anyway, he knew his insatiable longing for the presidency. Chase, he wrote to a friend, quote, has fallen into two bad habits. He thinks he has become indispensable to the country. He also thinks he ought to be president, unquote. By the summer of 1864, according to Lincoln, these two unfortunate tendencies had made Chase, quote, irritable and uncomfortable, so that he is never perfectly happy unless he is thoroughly miserable, unquote. In October 1864, Chief Justice Roger Taney finally passed away. I say finally because he was in his 80s, and the Republicans were waiting for the event to take place. This wouldn't be the first time that candidates to succeed an ailing justice waited hopefully for word that the end had come. However, realizing Chase's eager availability, matched by his inability to bring down his presidential fervor, you might say presidential fever, Lincoln hesitated. Again, he wrote, Chase, quote, is a man of unbounded ambition, working all his life to become president. That he can never be. And I fear that if I make him Chief Justice, he will simply become more restless and uneasy and neglect the place in his strife and intrigue to make himself president, unquote. although he let Chase sort of twist in the wind, you might say, for a number of weeks, as if only to keep him in suspense. Finally, on December 8th, 1864, he appointed Chase as Chief Justice, and the Senate confirmed Chase the same day. They did that once again, I might add, in 1921, when Warren Harding appointed William Howard Taft Chief Justice. Taft, of course, was the former President of the United States and is the only man in history to serve both as President and Chief Justice. Anyway, Chase served for less than 8 years, and although Lincoln did not live for more than a few months into his tenure, Lincoln was right. Chase continued to connive and scheme in his fruitless quest, and he died in 1873. His austere and aloof personality had not made his leadership role on the court any easier. Further, he now had the unpleasant experience of his colleagues telling him that they were better qualified than he was to be Chief Justice. Miller and Field, I suspect, were quite candid on that viewpoint. He had served for about 8 years, the shortest tenure among Lincoln's appointments. And there was no outbreak of national mourning after Chase's death. While the proper eulogies were printed, you can read them, private assessments were much more negative. And I'll give you 3 examples. One came from Rutherford Hayes, an acquaintance of Chase. He had succeeded Chase as governor of Ohio and would become president, serving 1 term. Rutherford Hayes recalled that Chase, quote, possessed noble gifts of intellect, as well as great culture and a commanding presence. But when this is said, about all that is favorable has been said. He was cold, selfish, and unscrupulous. Political intrigue, love of power, and a selfish and boundless ambition were the striking features of his life and character. Ebenezer Rockwood Hoar, Grant's former attorney general, and a lawyer of such integrity that he refused to support Senate diddling with patronage, and the Senate retaliated by refusing to confirm Hoar to the Supreme Court, one of Grant's failed appointments. But he wrote of Chase that he was, quote, insincere, selfish, and intriguing, and did more than anyone else to degrade and ruin the office of Chief Justice, unquote. But perhaps it was Samuel Miller who said it best. Miller had been on the court when Chase came. He was on the court when Chase died. Chase's considerable strengths, he later recalled, quote, had been warped, perverted, and shriveled by the selfishness generated by ambition. So much for Lincoln's final appointment to the court. Now, let me say very briefly a few words about Noah Swain and David Davis, the less significant. Swain, as I said, is the only Quaker I know of to have served on the Supreme Court. He was an ardent abolitionist, however. He came from Ohio. He was a Jacksonian Democrat, and when he found his views on slavery incompatible with the Democratic Party, he promptly joined the new Republican Party. He was a close friend of a judge on the Supreme Court whom Jackson had appointed and was still serving. John McLean, who, by the way, dissented in Dred Scott, one of his few claims to fame, McLean urged Lincoln to name Swain as his successor. And again, he was in the right place at the right time, from the right place, and Lincoln appointed him. Swain is the first Republican ever appointed to the Supreme Court. He served for almost 20 years. He's not distinguished, and his appointment is an excellent example of the title of this talk, Lincoln and the Politics of Reality. Swain was from Ohio, as I said, ardent abolitionist, strong supporter of the Union, and he did not hesitate to lobby for his own appointment. And indeed, Lincoln obliged after hearing countless references to the quality of Swain's legal talents. A few words about David Davis. As I mentioned, he stands out among the lesser distinguished judges because of one case. As I said, Lincoln and Davis had been friends for more than 20 years. He was Lincoln's campaign manager in 1860, and when Lincoln was assassinated 5 years later, his oldest son, Robert, who, by the way, became Secretary of War down the road, and Mary Todd Lincoln turned to David Davis to administer Lincoln's estate. He is best remembered for the famous case of Ex parte Milligan, which has resonated through modern history. You can't read of the Vietnam era without coming into contact with Ex parte Milligan. It was a key case in the case of the Nazi saboteurs in 1942. What Milligan said for a unanimous court, according to Davis, was that civilians cannot be tried by a military commission when the federal courts are open and functioning, as they were in Missouri. That was a unanimous opinion. But there was a second part to Ex parte Milligan. 5 out of the 9, 5 said Congress could never pass a statute that would permit civilians to be prosecuted by a military commission. And 4 justices dissented from that. So the case has significance because the Nazi saboteur case, cases of accused being housed in Guantanamo for months, if not years, and never tried, it has significance for our own time. And if you would like to see the relevance of a 1866 opinion for today, look at Ex parte Milligan. Now, one other case, I want to leave some time for questions. One other case, I talked about the blockade. In 1862, the Supreme Court took up the issue of the blockade. Was it constitutional? 8 or 9 ships had sued, their owners had sued on the grounds that the Union could not impound the ships and seize their cargoes. And the case was argued over a period of 8 or 9 days. In those days, you could talk almost as long as you wanted before the Supreme Court, not now. And Lincoln was very worried about this decision. In fact, he was prepared to either defy it or ignore it if push came to shove. So important did he see the blockade as to the survival of the Union. And when the decision came down, it was 5-4, and all the Lincoln appointments who were on the court at the time, Miller, Swain, and Davis, they all joined and made the majority. So that's probably the best example I can give you of Lincoln's sense of reality. And I think I'll end on that note and welcome your questions. I don't want to talk too long. Rich, are you there?
Yep. Okay, I'm back. I have a problem. If Abigail's there, I can't read the chat room. And the way it stands, we have so many, uh, over 100 participants from now, right on. So
There's only a couple questions, so I can read the questions from the chat room.
go ahead.
Okay, okay, the first is from Fernando, our Venezuelan member, and his question is about how Lincoln would have handled his second term in the post-war years, because he seemed quite, he embraced Southerners. He allowed, Grant to give very generous surrenders. So, what would the first 4 years of the Reconstruction have been like? Use your crystal ball, Professor.
I could spend 3 or 4 lectures on this, but
Okay.
the simple answer is we don't know. Lincoln was very closed-mouthed about his plans for the future. We do know that his last public address, he said something about encouraging Blacks who had fought in the Union Army to be given the right to vote. And we do know that John Wilkes Booth was in the audience that heard that. And it is assumed that that may have been the point where Booth decided he would try to kill the president if ever he had the opportunity. Lincoln was a most compassionate commander-in-chief. Once a week, I think it was on Friday, once a week, he spent all day reading death sentences issued by military court-martial. And wherever he could, he would reduce the penalty. Not always. Sometimes some were executed. But Lincoln, as a lawyer, did his best. Now, ask yourself how someone like Franklin Roosevelt, would he take a day to read all the cases coming up of the front in Europe in 1945, 44? I doubt it. Did Woodrow Wilson do that in World War I? I doubt it. But Lincoln did. So I would suspect that his Reconstruction plans were based on some sort of leniency once the South confessed error and vowed that secession could never happen again. I think that's the only thing we can say for sure. He looked forward to his second term, and it took a lot out of him, the war. If you look at the picture of Lincoln in 1861 and look at the famous Brady picture in 1865, you see what war does. Or if you want to take another thing, look at Franklin Roosevelt in 1932 and look at him in February of 1945, and you'll see what the presidency can do in terms of exhaustion. Okay, go on.
I wanted to just
Okay, very good.
Wait, 1 second. I wanted to tell the professor that question was asked from Fernando from Venezuela. And when's the last time you had a question from Venezuela? You're on.
Last night, called me collect.
The next question is from Judge Harper, and he wants to know, should there be a litmus test for the selection of Supreme Court justices? And if so, what should the litmus test be?
Well, it's interesting. I ought to tell you that I have a personal perspective on this because my dad was a judge in the state of Massachusetts who was appointed by the governor, who was a good friend of his and happened to be Dwight Eisenhower's last Secretary of State. So the litmus test is often based on personal acquaintance. And 2 of the 5 appointments were very well known to Lincoln. But he also wrote to a friend that we have to see what they've done. In the case of Davis and Field, he could see the briefs, he could see the cases, he could see the decisions Field had done on the Supreme Court of California. That would be a sort of litmus test. Now, there's a rigorous procedure for vetting possible nominees to the Supreme Court. Someone like Donald Trump, for whom my admiration is in rigid self-control, someone like Donald Trump would have his staff pick carefully among candidates who espoused his values, and every one of the Trump appointments has demonstrated that. That's the type of litmus test you might consider prevalent today. I think that's extremely unfortunate, and it's unique to Trump. One of my closest friends in college, my first year, was my dorm mate. He lived on the 1st floor. I lived on the 3rd floor. His name was David Souter. You may have heard of him. George Bush appointed David to the Supreme Court. David was known at the time as a staunch but moderate conservative. Well, as you know, that litmus test didn't work because David Souter became one of the great liberals of the court. And how I miss him. So that's what I would say about that.
Okay, we have another question, and as Rich pointed out, you probably never had 2 questions from Venezuela before, but we have a second one. And this is Fernando saying, he points out that in Venezuela, slavery, they also had slavery, got abolished before their own civil war, 1859 to 1863. But the former slaves had a big problem. They were in terrible economic conditions. Okay, they didn't have the tools to start their own lives. So he's wondering, what Lincoln would have done. Would he have done something similar to the 40 acres and a mule? What would he have done differently than Andrew Johnson did?
Lincoln was very much aware that the South suffered during the war. He had proposed, indeed, he even brought a group of free blacks into the White House to talk about it. He had proposed a scheme where, for federal money, the blacks would be encouraged to emigrate to an island in the Isthmus of Panama. And it never got off the ground. But to read about it and to read Lincoln's comments to the blacks is fascinating. And it's not what you associate with Abraham Lincoln. Now, if you say Lincoln was a racist, everyone, I suspect, in the United States in 1863 was a racist. But that didn't mean you didn't have certain rights. And it didn't mean that slavery wasn't offensive. And it didn't mean that the South could secede. And it didn't mean that slavery could expand. So as the war ended, Lincoln realized that the Emancipation Proclamation, which had freed the Southern slaves in the areas not occupied by the Union Army, again, how significant could that have been? The real significance of the Emancipation Proclamation is in what it implied, not what it did. What it implied was that union and abolition were linked permanently. So I would say that the 40 acres and a mule, which is more myth than reality, was indicative of the aid that would be coming from the early part of the Johnson administration, but not full on. If you want to have some fun, compare the way the New Deal dealt with federal aid to the end of the Civil War and Andrew Johnson's tenure as president. Lincoln barely knew Johnson. Again, it's not even clear if he had met him more than once or twice. He certainly didn't know his opinions, but Johnson turned out to have been a white supremacist from the get-go and bitterly opposed to black suffrage and the rest of it. But that's I say that's another story. So I think Lincoln would have expected Congress to come up with some support for the freed slaves.
Abigail, take just 3 questions, so we'll be able to end tonight on time. Okay.
Okay.
And I'll add a few words after Professor.
Okay, here's just
Lurie
a comment from John Sullivan, who says the Nazi saboteurs case was actually ex parte Quirin, Q-U-I-R-I-N.
That is correct. What did I say it was?
Ex parte Milligan.
Oh, that's a different case. The ex parte, I said the ex parte Milligan case was very important to the court in 1942, trying to work their way around a decision that would be acceptable to Roosevelt, because Roosevelt had said to his aides point blank after the saboteurs had been arrested, he said, "I won't give them back," he said. "I won't do it." And the court was very much aware of that. And in 1942, you don't want a confrontation between probably the most popular president thus far in our history, Franklin Roosevelt, and the Supreme Court. So in ex parte Milligan, that issue was not significant. In ex parte Quirin, it was indeed. And if you read any of the books about the case, I'm thinking of Alpheus Thomas Mason's biography of Harlan Stone, who was the Chief Justice during ex parte Quirin. You'll get a sense of the military reality that sometimes can permeate Supreme Court chambers.
Okay, we have 2 more questions. Then we won't take you. One is from Dr. Braverman, who asks, didn't Benjamin Robbins Curtis criticize his habeas corpus decision?
There were 2 justices who dissented in Dred Scott. One was Judge Curtis, one was Justice McLean. He did indeed. And I don't remember, I think it was Curtis who was so offended by the Dred Scott decision that he shortly thereafter resigned from the court.
Okay, and last question, was Grant influenced in his treatment of former slaves by Lincoln's approach of malice to none? That's from Montheimer.
That's an interesting question. Grant grew in kindness as the war went on. I don't know if he was influenced by Lincoln so much, because once Lincoln found a general he could trust, and it took, I say, almost 4 years to find Grant, he let Grant have his way, and he did not interfere, unlike the 3 or 4 generals who had come and gone before. And when Sheridan, a friend of William Sherman, Sherman is commanding the troops in the southern part of the country, Sheridan wrote to a friend that, this is in April 1865, "If the thing is pressed, I think Lee will surrender," unquote. And Lincoln telegraphed back, "Let the thing be pressed," unquote. It was.
Before you go further, that
That's it
last
for
question
the
from Don
questions.
Monheimer from Las Vegas, New Mexico. So now you got questions from Venezuela and New Mexico. He's a retired attorney from New Jersey.
Okay, that's all for the questions. So you can finish up, Rich.
Thank you. I want to thank you for another great lecture. Your lectures are such great learning experiences. And I think what I know point blank what's amazed people is that the questions you've asked and citing back the cases at them is just that's really incredible. And I want to thank you for that. Next month, Professor Lurie will be returning. If you have received the link from me, not from the library, if you received it from me, you'll automatically get the link. You'll get a notice saying request the link, etc. You don't have to. You'll get it. You're in special list for Professor Lurie. I'd like you also to know that at one point of the evening, we had 128 participants. So, which is really, it's really a great showing for us. It's Memorial Day or Decoration Day this week, so it's a significant weekend this weekend. But again, I want to thank you and for all attending, and I'll see you here again next month.
And both of the recordings will be posted on our YouTube channel in a couple of days.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
I'm gonna end the meeting now, okay?
Okay.
So thank you everybody for attending.
Excellent, excellent job tonight.